The Jael Finishing School for Ladies, Etiquette for Dangerous Women, by Jaime Hope McArdle, read by the author. Introduction. This story, like much of the Bible, isn't for the faint of heart. There's so much to unearth about women and the complex role we are called to. First thing to consider is, it was during the time Deborah was judge of Israel. To understand this era, we're going to need some backstory. This is the era of judges. Almost everyone has heard the story of Moses, the plagues on Egypt, let my people go, the 10 Commandments, the burning bush. If you missed the stories in Sunday school, they've worked their way into popular culture and movies enough to be familiar on some level. To fill in some gaps, God's chosen people, when it was really just a big family, were living out a widespread famine in Egypt way back. At that time, they were a great help to Pharaoh because God had given a heads up to one of his people, Joseph, that the famine was coming with enough lead time to prepare. Egypt had enough food to thrive in a desperate time, and Joseph, son of Jacob, ended up the equivalent of Prime Minister of Egypt. The people God brought there were successful and grew into a nation within a nation. However, over time, new leaders came to power that forgot how those people of God, the nation of Israel, or what today we call Jews, had saved the country and made it rich. They grew fearful of their success in numbers and began to turn against them. Over time, the Jews became slaves in Egypt, but God did not forget them. In fact, much like Joseph's personal enslavement story, they continued to have God's favor, and the nation of Israel grew even in oppression. This made the rulers of Egypt devise a plan to kill all the boys who were born for a time in order to control the population. There was one woman in particular who had the courage to hide her little son and then take him to the Nile River and set him afloat in a basket in the hope that somehow he might survive. What a crazy plan! He could have been crocodile food or drowned, but God had a purpose for this little one, and he was picked up by an Egyptian princess and raised as her own in the palace. We know him as Moses. And not only did he survive, he was educated in the palace as a prince and became the one God used to set his people free. When the time was right, Moses brought the people who were in generations of slavery out of Egypt. This is a fascinating story of God versus the powers of darkness. Moses, as the representative of God, went head-to-head with Pharaoh, the evil king of Egypt, who the prince of darkness was using to keep God's people in chains. You definitely should read the backstory if you haven't. It starts in Exodus, as in the exit out of slavery in Egypt. God brought the people out of Egypt, but the people refused to allow God to get the Egypt out of them. That transition was difficult and meant a lot of lessons in the wilderness, such that only 2 men from the original population God delivered saw the entry to the Promised Land, Joshua and Caleb. The next generation, born in the wilderness, born in freedom, came into the Promised Land one parcel at a time under the leadership of Joshua. God was clear that he was raising up a nation to represent him to the world. God could have sent the angel of death on ahead and cleared out the place for the people to move on in, but that would have left his people weak and shallow. They were only one generation from slave mentality, and God wanted people who stood tall and walked into their freedom and had strength and light for the world. He made it clear that he would train them to take the land one territory at a time, and he would leave some of the inhabitants for a time in order to work the land not yet taken, so it didn't go to a wasteland, but also use them to train his people to have courage and to partner with God to fight for freedom and justice. We can see in reading that God's people had lots of flaws and weakness, and the enemy civilizations were also used to give the people of Israel times of check and balance and put them into a timeout when they strayed. Farther back in Genesis, there's a passage I find fascinating. While God is talking to Abraham, the father of the nation of Israel, about what will happen to his future generations, he tells a story of a people who wander in the land that is not their own and then become servants or slaves for 400 years. But someday they will return to the land promised to be their home, in the 4th generation. For the iniquity of the Amorites is not yet complete. There is much we do not understand about God's plan, but he told Abraham generations in advance that his chosen people would grow into a nation under oppression, and he would not set them free until the evil of the people in the land came to a fullness that brought judgment upon them. Something we don't seem to contextualize as a modern Western culture is that many of our basic tenets are based on the laws God gave to his people. We value life and have laws to protect it. We have a justice system and fight against oppression. Though the humans in these systems create lots of complications and problems, we struggle with greed and power-hungry individuals. The basic ideals we uphold are sanctity of life, freedom, and justice. The cultures of other ancient civilizations were not based on freedom and justice. They lived with pagan rituals that used women and boys and men in their temples as prostitutes, and their custom was human sacrifice, mostly children, in the fire to their own gods. God created humans in his own image and demands that all lives are worthy of honor and respect. Yet he also gives us all the choice to decide for ourselves, choose life or choose death. The attitude of do whatever feels good and makes you happy way of life usually ends up hurting and dehumanizing people around you. This sickens God to the heart. He allowed these cultures to continue until their time of living in this horrific way was complete. It seems likely he also gave them time to change their ways and make a better choice. When they didn't, and time was up, he brought his people to come in to bring judgment and take back the land. The instructions for the chosen people were to live the way that honored God and the people around them, and choose differently from the destructive and selfish cultures in ancient times. The 10 Commandments, which are based on life having dignity and honoring your neighbor as yourself, were radically different from the ancient way of life of that era. As long as the people of Israel were close to God and allowed him to be king of their lives and nation, God blessed them and he protected them. They were a light to other nations of how people should live, honoring the God who created them and each other. It seemed that whenever they got too comfortable, they would stray, get distracted, and begin to dabble or dive into things that would destroy them. God's laws and rules were not random. He created the universe, and he knew if they took paths of evil, it would lead to their own demise, pain, and death. When he punished them, it was to help them come back to their freedom and life. Proverbs 14:12 reads, "There is a way that seems right to a man, but in the end it leads to death." During this first period of taking over the land, the nation of Israel was directly under God. He was their king. He gave them his rules, and he went with them. He fought in their battles. He spoke to their leaders. He set judges in place to help solve disputes and direct foreign affairs. He had prophets, both men and women, that he spoke with directly to help guide the people. During the story of Jael and Sisera, we read that it was the time that Deborah was a prophet and judge of Israel. This tells us the main leader of the nation of Israel at the time, and the one God spoke most directly to, was a woman. A woman under God himself led the nation at this critical time. Many people incorrectly assume that Christianity and following the God of the Bible is either anti-woman or oppressive to women. As in any book, passages can be taken out of context and used by people to oppress others and push their own agendas. They will be successful to the extent the ones they seek to oppress and convince know the truth. If one were to study the entire Bible texts without bias, one would see evidence that God champions women time after time and intends for men and women to work together in complementary roles. Sometimes women were put in vitally important positions where nations hinged on their strength, and this story is one of those. The people had turned to evil, and God sold them back into oppression for a time. Think of it like a timeout to stop, reconsider your choices, and make better ones. What happened when the people turned to evil is they forgot who they were. They were chosen to be God's representatives to the world. This meant they needed to live differently than the cultures around them. This was truly their one job. Just get this right. Love God with your whole self. Build your culture on justice for the poor. Love the people around you and consider life sacred. Honor your parents. Care for the young. Treat foreigners in the nation with dignity and friendship. Do not worship money, power, or yourself, but instead turn to God who cares for you and provides all good things. Learn his laws and then keep them because they bring life and honor. be a shining light of how to live well. This particular time out was about 20 years. God decided their punishment was done. This might have been about how long it took for them to feel enough discomfort to want to stop trying their own ways that led to destruction and begin to seek God and ask Him to intervene. This is where the story of Deborah and Jael picks up.